Hi, in this video I'm going to show you something a little bit different, how to make a magic wand using a stick and our PaperLathe Tassel and Bead System. So let's get started. So the first thing that you'll need is a stick of some description. I've got a stick that I have picked up and dried out. You could use a pencil, you could use a wooden knitting needle. Really, it's entirely up to you, depending on what you would like your wand to look like. So the next thing that you need is to print out some shapes from the PaperLathe system. Now, I've basically printed out two different shapes, and as we go through, it will become clearer how you use them. But the PaperLathe system is basically a series of PDFs. And so you choose the shapes that you want to create, print out the sheets at full size, and obviously don't use double-sided because that will mess everything up. And you cut along the solid line. So you need to basically cut out all of these strips. So I'll start some of these and then I will skip ahead because I'm sure you don't need to watch me cutting loads and loads of strips. You can use a paper trimmer if you're happy using a paper trimmer. You could use a scalpel and straight edge if that's how you like to cut strips. But it works perfectly fine just using a pair of scissors, so you don't need to worry yourself. Now this particular shape that I'm cutting out, my intention is that it will go at the end of the wand. Now the other thing that you will need is some PVA glue, clear drying. I like to water it down just a little bit, which is why you can see that it's sitting in this little pot. I like to make sure that it's a consistency of a thick cream, and some PVAs obviously are very, very thick and some are very thin. The thinner ones actually work best for this, although they will take a little bit longer to dry. And of course, at the end of it, you'll need whatever types of paints or inks that you want to color your wand. Paint is actually better for what we're doing because we're mixing up a natural stick and paper. And the other thing that I wanted to say is if you're using the PaperLathe system, you don't need to use any fancy paper. In fact, it works very, very well with just your regular old 80-gram copy paper. You don't need to worry about having anything nice. So when we've cut it out, we keep this section because this section, it tells us what order to place the strips. So I'll turn around those strips just so that you can actually see. You see, we've got the numbers across the top here. My numbers are slightly cut off, primarily because my particular printer has a different margin, but that doesn't matter. Again, the numbers are there. If you have any trouble, you can always pencil them in yourself. Now my stick has a bit of a broken up end, which is fine. Again, this is going to be the end that I'm going to cover. So I'm just taking off a little bit of that spare bark. I'm not going to worry about this being frayed. And instead of using the rods that come with the PaperLathe system, I'm going to go ahead and glue directly to the stick. So initially I'm going to need a fair bit of glue. So I'll start with number 1. I'm going to turn it around so that the numbers remain upright. So the first thing to do is add some glue to the stick. And I want to make sure I have a good amount here, because this will also act as a sealant, so that when we go in to paint, it's not going to just soak it all up. And I'm going to go as close to the edge as I can. And then I'm going to start rolling it around the stick. Now, you're going to get an irregular roll because you're using an irregular stick. I'm going to turn it round once I've just got it started. And put some glue here. You see, I've just torn that a little bit, and that's because of the irregular stick. But don't worry, just going to take our time and roll it as best we can around that stick, because we want some of that unusual texture of the stick to remain. So as you can see, I'm just slightly changing it. So your shape won't be exactly the same as the shape that you have actually printed out, unless you were to use a nice straight stick. So if you were to use a nice, like that, a nice knitting, bamboo knitting needle, that's nice and straight for your wand, and that of course will give you exactly the shape that the profile of the shape that you've printed out. But because we're going to go around this stick and we're going to let the stick also dictate some of the shape, just roll that around. But normally what you do is try to keep it as straight a roll as absolutely possible, so that you're only rolling directly on top of the same strip. Now I've got a little bit of gap in there, and I just want to make sure that any of those gaps, because this isn't a perfect stick, just get filled up under there, and I may as well do it now to make sure that that piece sticks. So we have number 1 and in brackets number 2, so that tells you that number 2 is what needs to be rolled next. So we'll put some glue, and we shall get strip number 2, and it fits. You can see where there's a dashed line, so number 2 lines up between the dashed line of number 1. And now that we've started number 1, we should be able to line up now much more evenly, because we've given ourselves an even surface. So now roll around, gluing it as you go. And line up the straight lines. Add a bit more glue. Always try to make sure that your end is nicely sealed in there as well. Okay, and now 2 tells us that 3 goes into the next space. So it's really quite straightforward a system, but you'll get some lovely shapes. So I'm placing number 3 in between the dotted lines of number 2. The other thing about the system is that as you're rolling, You can, of course, just decide, well, actually, I like it as it is, and not carry on with the shape. You could decide, well, that's enough for that wand, that's heavy enough, that's enough of a handle, and I'll leave it at that. But, of course, you can carry on to make the shape. So 3 needs number 4 over it. The other thing to remember is that the shapes themselves, as I said, they do change depending on what you're rolling them around. And so that's why in the PaperLathe system you have different shapes of rod, so that you can create unusual shapes by rolling them around, for instance, a triangle or a square shape. And as you'll see, the direction that I'm turning them, that I'm turning this around, is actually giving us the profile here. So had I wanted that part on the other way of the pointing that way, then I would work it this way with the wand out. So you do have to think about that a little bit, but sometimes I think just letting it happen is actually quite cool as well. So now number 4 is telling us we need number 5, again in that space. And so long as your strips are always put on in the same direction, so in this case, so that the number is last, then it will all work. And so now, I'm getting through it now, and the wand, the shape of the wand is now changing because we've got this acorn shape at the end that's developing. And 5 needs 6. And again, in the spaces that are in between the dotted lines, as you can see, I don't care about having a messy desk. I'll wash all the glue off later, but you might want to consider using, if you haven't got a wipeable surface, use a mat to protect your work surface. As the strips get smaller, you'll also find it easier to put the glue directly onto the shape. I think the nice thing about it is it's not super critical either. Okay, we've got the last one now. It's only super critical if you were going to make whole sets. Now, of course, the last one, it doesn't really matter whether I'm going which direction, because it's the last one on. You know, whether I start with the number first or the number second at the end, it doesn't really matter. But as you can see, it's much easier to put the glue directly onto the shape now for the last one, because that's just so fine. And I am in a rather sticky mess already. Now the second shape that I'm going to use is a fairly complex shape, but I don't want it to end up quite as big as the full size of the pattern. So I'll show you what I'm going to do on that in just a second. Okay, so there is the end of our wand. Again, I'm going to pop some more glue in there, and I'm going to pop some glue here at the end, the very end, because I want to make sure that that seals in there nicely. Now, of course, you do have to leave these to dry completely before painting them. But there's step one. I'm going to tidy up the desk, and I'm going to then show you what we need to do for the second shape. So for the second shape, I don't want it to be as fat as it's going to end up if I use all of the sheets of paper, because there's actually 2 sheets of paper, so that's a lot of strips, all right? So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it where these lines are, okay? So this is how you can make different shapes. You can cut it so that you have a 2/3 by cutting it here, half so that you end up with 2 shapes for your piece of paper, or even just a 1/3 across the top here. Now, because the wand is quite thin, my particular stick is quite thin, I think I'm just going to go with the 1/3, and we'll see how that works. And if I hate it, well, I'll just have to live with it. So the first thing to do is to cut off the instructions, because you don't want to chop those in half. The instructions are printed on both of the sheets if any of the shapes have numerous sheets, all the way through, but you don't need, you know, both of them, if you see what I'm saying. So we can cut this one straight across. And then I'm just going to cut straight across before I start. So that's my 3rd sheet, and on this one, my 3rd sheet. And if you've got a paper trimmer to use, then obviously that's that bit better to keep a really straight line. But again, because of the stick that I'm using, I'm not really that worried about what I'm actually doing. I'm not worried about the fact that it's a little bit crooked. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut out all of the strips, again, just like the other shape, cutting them out on the solid line. Okay, so I've cut out all of the various strips, of which there are a lot. So I've got them placed here and I've got them placed over to the side. And I'm going to now put this unusual shape on, okay? This works in exactly the same way as with the rest of the paper lathe. You just have to follow the instructions. But of course, this is going to go over this curved area. So we may have to make a few adaptations as we go. And of course, this will all, as before, depend upon the stick that you choose to use. So I'm going to choose that section there because that looks about the straightest. And I'm going to wrap. And I'm going to wrap it so that it sort of fills the area, which means squishing it in a little bit along here. That's all right. That'll add a little bit of texture. That it will come out as the various other strips are put into place. You won't notice this, but that's what you need to do if you're going to fix it onto something solid. It's basically make it fit. Here we go. So that's gotten that on quite nicely. So now from number 1, we need to put number 2. And that, because there's no dotted lines on number 1, that just lays basically straight on the top. So lining up the top and bottom edges. And again, because of this irregular shape, you'll need to do that as best you can. Because obviously, if you're going to be using a natural twig, it's going to be different. I want to make sure that's on there nice and tight as well, and actually glued to the stick itself. Now what's happening here is that there are 4 sections. So the first section says to work with strip number 3. So the way that this will build up is that each of these ridges will build up in succession, which is also nice when you're doing something natural looking like this, because you can also decide to leave one out if you want to. So you can make even more shapes. So we'll start, just as the instructions say, with strip number 3. And because of this irregular shape, you can see that I'm getting quite covered in glue, but don't worry about that, because we're going to paint this over. When you're working the system on the acrylic rods and your sorry, I've just put that one on upside down, which means you won't be able to see the marks. It wouldn't have made a difference on this, but let's turn it around. So as you can see, there aren't any marks on this one. There's no dashed lines. Yeah, as I was saying, it's easy to do this very neatly if you want to, if you're using the acrylic rods that come with the system. It's much neater than trying to push it in around a natural twig. So here we go with the next strip. And as they're starting to get and because I'm only using the short strips, it's not going to be quite as a fat shape. And then you can see now 4 goes to 5, dotted lines in between. I'm going to rub that one around a little. And then 5, and so on. So what I'm going to do, so that this doesn't take too long for you to watch, is I'm going to stop this, and I'm going to carry on and add all of the strips and make up the next shape. So here we are, one handle to a wand. I like the quirkiness of how it's curved around because the stick is curved. This now needs to dry thoroughly. I am also going to, because this is a natural stick, coat the whole thing in the PVA so that when I paint it, it will go on more easily. I am going to leave this to dry and paint it, because you don't need to see me just brushing a single color of paint on it before we come back to the next stage. So here, finished wand, painted up. And then the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of gilding wax on. Of course, you can use mica, you can leave it as it is. The decoration part is really entirely up to you. I just want to use a few bits. There's something else, when I painted it, I didn't sand down, so you can just sort of see the ridges. That's the effect that I wanted. But you can actually take an emery and sand down these bits so that you get an even smoother look. It really is entirely up to you. But you can see that by leaving them as they are, you get ridges for your micas or your gilding wax to actually work on and stand out. So let me just do these. As I say, it really depends on sort of what kind of finish that you want to put onto it. You might wish to paint it all one color, or you might wish to make it a more metallic look. It's entirely up to you. Of course, micas and gilding waxes work very nicely because you've got the raised areas that you can polish up as well. Just make sure that you leave everything to dry well before you, or leave your paint to dry well before you start on this additional decoration. And put a little bit on the wand itself because that helps all of those, because I left the bark and the texture of the twig. It's nice to have some of that stand out as well. And obviously I'll polish that all up so it get it really shiny and buffed up later on. But that just gives you a general idea. Now the next thing I'm going to show you is to just add a little bit of textile, because after all, it isn't a textile passementerie magic wand without actually having some thread on it. I'm going to use some sparkly thread. This is just a sort of everyday sparkly thread. It's very thin, so it's like a machine thread. And I'm just going to double it over a few times to make up a piece that is slightly thicker, okay? If you have a thicker thread, you don't need to do this step. Now I'm going to hold, in fact, let me trim these off tidy so that you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. I'm going to hold those in a loop, okay, so that one end is in a loop. And then in this depression, I'm going to hold it so that that loop is down on one side. Now the long piece, I'm going to wrap around, covering up the short end of the loop. Okay, just go around nice and evenly in this depression. When that's filled, I'll then take the long ends through the loop that we created before, and then the short ends of the loop I'm going to pull up. Okay, you can just see, got one that didn't want to go up. Pull up, and this will, the long end will just start to creep underneath the threads. I'm going to cut that quite close up, and then I'm going to pull that up so that that gets covered up and pulls that end underneath. Take your time with it and pull it through. And then with this one, pull it up nice and taut and cut. And there you are. You don't even see that there is a knot or anything there. Now, if you want a little bit of extra protection because you know that this wand is going to be handled as opposed to being decorative, go ahead and pop a little bit of glue just over that joint. You can also put a little bit of glue down before you start. And so this way you can sort of add a little bit of extra gem, a little bit like it's got a silver collar. So let's do one of the other ones. And we'll do it in the same way. So a loop. Hold the loop at one direction. Wrap the threads over the end of the loop. Bring the thread through those threads. As I say, if you've got a thick thread, you only need to use one thread. You don't need to use a group of them. It's just using a group makes it a lot easier when you've got a thin thread. Bring it up. Adjust if any are loose, which I have one there that's just a little loose. There we go. Cut as close as I can. Pull up. And then cut this one as close as I can. And there we have a little bit of silver decoration to add to the wand. And I'll carry on polishing up the rest of it to make it look all pretty and magical. You could also add some gems or whatever onto it as well. Thanks very much for watching.